Hello everybody, my name is Jeremy and you're watching The Morgue, where you don't have to roll a natural 20 to be critical. Today's show is going to be all about player housing, and as a little bit of a break from our usual format, I'm actually inviting some correspondents to join me on the show today to speak with me about a couple different games from each of them. I've got 3 different correspondents joining us, and we're going to be talking about a number of different games that have featured forms of player housing over the years. Now, despite player housing having been around since almost as long as the MMO industry itself, this is a feature that's never really gotten much footing. And the core of today's editorial is going to be kind of exploring the different ways that it has been implemented over the years and some of the reasons why it hasn't become quite as widely accepted as such a well-weathered feature typically would. But before we get those people on the line, call our guests in, and get to talking about the meat of today's episode, I have a very special announcement to make. And once again, it is time for gamers everywhere to celebrate. You see, just the other day, the Supreme Court decided in a 7-2 ruling to uphold an earlier court's decision to overrule a California-based law that would have placed significant restrictions on the sales of what they considered extremely violent video games. Now, I won't get into all the details specifically of the law itself, but suffice it to say that it was going to be very bad news for gamers if this went through. And not just because we like to get our frag on and watch our buddies' heads explode in fountains of gore. No, this was a deeper issue. You see, what this actually came down to is First Amendment rights within the U.S. That is to say, our freedom of speech, and whether or not video games qualify as a form of media that is protected by the First Amendment. And according to the highest authority that we currently honor, they are. In fact, this decision by the Supreme Court went so far as to quote their own ruling from the 1950s on a similar case that was against film. This ruling sets a precedent, in fact a super precedent, that video games now stand shoulder to shoulder with books and film as a form of media that can be protected by First Amendment rights. Furthermore, it places additional faith in non-government agencies like the ESRB to properly categorize the content that we are now guaranteed freedom to enjoy at our leisure. Now, this isn't a free pass, though, and some of the press have been taking that ball and running with it and saying that, oh, video games are going to be now as violent as they want because the Supreme Court made it okay. No. What this means is that the video game industry can now police itself and won't be subject to all these crazy litigators out there that try to blame it for the bad choices of the youth of America. Not that complaints about violent subject matter will ever really go away, but at least with this ruling, maybe it'll get under control. All right, well, with that out of the way, let's talk about player housing. Our first correspondent today is a gal that goes by the name of Ruth. Ruth used to be a GM for Second Life. If I remember correctly, you worked there for a total of 6 years, is that right?
That's correct.
And just recently retired from Linden Labs.
That's correct.
Well, now, I guess that's a great place to start, because if you really think about it, I don't know if you guys out there are familiar with Second Life, but their concept of player housing is so out there. It's pretty much that is as far as you could conceivably go with the mechanic on a whole. I mean, you can customize everything about it, and it is so... Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Ruth, but basically when you get down to it, the concept of owning and customizing your own home in Second Life is the point of the game to a certain extent, correct?
To a certain extent, yes, but also the commerce was a very big factor of selling items and services to another player and then taking the cash you make from those sales and changing them into real money.
Right. Now, that
so
includes...
The main goal was to make real money.
That was the main goal, was to make real money. Well,
yes.
That's my main goal as well, so I should have been playing that game. Now, but one of the things that you could sell to and from each other was properties and things to decorate your properties with, which seemed to be one of the primary ways that people made that money, outside of services that we won't go into at this time. At least those are some of the things that get more press around here. But tell me, just generally speaking, Ruth, with having an entire economy, an entire community based around this, is there anything unique to that particular type of atmosphere that you don't see in other MMOs because it was based around that?
Well, basically, when you play an MMO, the company that develops it is going to only give you what they want you to have. Such as like an epic weapon or an epic set of armor or, certain raid encounters. Those are things that they develop and they control what you're able to do in the game. As far as your Second Life, that was more user-generated.
Hmm.
So if someone wanted to build a nightclub and have other avatars come there to dance, they had, the total free reign on that, and they could do that. As long as they, stay with the terms of service. But they were there to, have fun and talk with other users and hang out, which is not possible really in an MMO because you can't really make anything yourself. You have to use what the company is giving you to use.
Now let's just take a hypothetical here. What if an actual like AAA type MMO wanted to attempt to emulate this particular set of mechanics in their form of player housing? If they wanted to make you able to make whatever you wanted to and whatever kind of house and whatever kind of decorations you wanted to, are there any particular pitfalls to that type of mechanic that they might have to stay away from in order to avoid? Well, like you worked as a GM, are there particular customer service issues that were a regular recurrence?
Well, the problem is that usually when people would set up these properties, they would set them up with other avatars. And they would, enter into, and sometimes there would be marriages, sometimes there would be employer-employee type of agreements, or anything else you could think of as far as like a partnership.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the partnerships would go bad, and they would enlist us to try to mediate them. We were allowed to mediate, but we were not allowed to, settle the dispute. They had to settle it themselves.
Right.
And the pitfall that you can fall into is that using customer service resources to basically handle these little tiffs and disputes where they might be able to use those resources elsewhere.
Right.
For people with real problems. So basically the customer service supported people that were having technical problems with using the product. It was not, most of the time it was not, player disputes, but that did sneak in there. So I would recommend that a pitfall, to avoid is to try to make sure that you have enough people to handle the regular day-to-day problems with the product and then have at least enough to do the customer service things that may deal with player disputes.
Right, because you don't want to let that get out of hand. If your community starts to get disenfranchised with itself, that's just a downward spiral.
Any environment like that is going to have griefing, and someone has to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let's go ahead and move on. I'm not all that knowledgeable about Second Life. Is there anything else that you would like to bring up on the topic, or should we move into Everquest II?
Well, Second Life, had a lot of very nice things. Now, sometimes you read about Second Life and you read about kind of strange happenings, which I probably should not get into, but I'm just saying there were some different types of happenings going on in Second Life. There were also some very good things going on in Second Life, such as cancer support groups and mental health groups, universities giving classes so that people can self-improve themselves and things like that. So there was a good side and there was a bad side. Now the bad side was basically very good as far as like an economic standpoint. Even because the content was adult content, it made a lot of money on that side, even though it was not something that's generally held in high regard. But that was what made a lot of money. But there was also the good
side.
And
that's what got most of the press for Second Life over the course of it.
Yes, there were many, many things that went on. But otherwise, it was a very good experience for my working there, and I really enjoyed it. I met some very interesting people from all over the world. And basically, I got to be a GM, a recess mom, a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, just about anything that you could think of to throw on that title. You basically found yourself doing.
That's a heck of a resume from a single job.
Yes.
Actually, that's a great segue because one of the things that I wanted to bring up with the next game to talk about is the community around that tends to evolve around creative aspects of a game. And in Everquest II, Everquest II had one of the best, in my opinion, player housing systems that I've currently to date seen in an MMO. And you mentioned earlier being able to interact with people all over the world and get to know them. One of my buddies that I met and got to know online, we entirely started talking through the course of crafting items for our homes and decorating our homes and our guildmates' homes. And this is a friendship that was entirely online. We've never met in real life. And even several years later, I was playing that probably 6 or 7 years ago. I still keep in touch through forums and things like that. We've been introduced to each other's circle of friends. And all of that came about because of a sharing of ideas over a creative process, which was, in this case, Everquest II's housing. Now, how familiar are you with Everquest II's housing, Ruth?
I haven't played EverQuest 2 in a while, but while I was playing, I did own a house. It was like a small ghetto kind of on the scale as
Lower
far
Freeport?
as like yeah, it was pretty low. But it was I only went in there to craft and so forth.
Now, when you compare EverQuest 2 to Second Life, obviously EverQuest 2 is going to feel much more limited. It was basically pre-made items that you could arrange in pretty limited ways within your homes, but there was still quite a bit of creativity there used from layering items on top of one another, etc. But the real big limiting factor there was that you usually had to either craft or grind out specific quests to obtain some of the more rare and prestigious items. And actually, prestige is something that I wanted to mention. I believe that's what it was called in the game, where you had to pay an extra form of currency to not only buy a house, but to hold on to it on a monthly basis, or a weekly basis, if I remember correctly. You had to pay rent in the form of this extra currency that couldn't be gained by buying and selling items.
That's right. You did have to pay rent, and if you didn't pay, it would close you out. You wouldn't be able to get in until you paid it.
You could get shut out of your own home.
That's correct.
What do you think about that? I mean, if you think about the average player out there, there's always, well, in essence, let me back up. In essence, this system introduced a currency that could only be used for very specific items that only a very specific subsect of the player set actually made any use of. I mean, you could go your entire life in EverQuest 2 and never even step foot in the apartment that you owned or rented. But if you wanted to really pursue that, you had a whole separate currency. Do you think that's something that was done well in this game, or it was an unnecessary roadblock? Or
Well, there were a number of, as in Second Life, there were a lot of people that really were into the decoration thing and the social thing, and which you find the same thing in MMOs. And that subset of users basically really like to spend a lot of time in their homes and arranging things and adding new things, acquiring new things, doing whatever is necessary. They will also pay real money if the company offers specific items for real money. They'll purchase those and they'll be very proud of them. And then they'll invite their friends over for crafting and so forth. The thing is that they are stuck with what exactly the developing company wants them to have. So they have to make do with what is given to them. But it is amazing to find out what people can really do. I mean, I saw some very elaborate, beautiful homes, which made mine look like, a stone's throw off a river. It looked terrible compared to theirs, But they really like that. Now, the thing is that what it does is in a developing company, it encourages someone to keep coming back, to maintain their home, to maintain relationships they've made with the home from friends crafting. So it perpetuates the pay-to-play cycle of people staying subscribed. Because if they don't play, they lose their home. And they worked very hard on it. They don't want to lose it, so they keep playing.
Now,
so it's a good thing.
Having come from a developer like yourself, has it ever been discussed internally about the fact that creating player housing and creating a place where players want to spend a lot of time in a single location, what's the payoff there in terms of amount of time invested in developing that feature versus the actual payoff of the amount of people that spend the amount of time that players spend enjoying that feature? Has that ever really been examined?
I don't really know, but I know in Second Life, people really, really enjoyed customizing, changing, improving. One thing that was very common in Second Life was the fact that when you owned land, it only supported a certain amount of objects. So if your chair had 5 objects to comprise the chair, then that was 4, or 5 objects that went against your object count for the size of land that you owned. So if you owned a very large part of land, then you had more objects to use. Also, when people would come over to different areas that were having an event of some sort, like a nightclub, dancing, or a lecture, or anything like that, any kind of social gathering, they would sometimes be able to bring their own objects and interact those with other people. I don't think that was possible in EQ2 housing.
I don't think that's been possible in any game.
Right, but in Second Life, actually, if the permissions were set, that allowed an outside user that did not own the land could come in and place like a dance machine down if they needed to, and then take it when they were done, and leave the area with the machine. These are all things that EQ2 isn't capable of, but the system in EQ2
the core fact that people in Second Life would get together at people's properties is not really something that you frequently see. It's been seen in some forms of player housing where it was specifically geared around public housing. Like my next caller, we're going to be talking about Star Wars Galaxies, and they had public houses and that, like cantinas and such. But in EQ2, it was your private home, it was your apartment or your house, and hearing about people holding parties there on a regular basis is not something that came up as much as just showing off what you had decorated. Now, a lot of those items that those hardcore EQ2 decorators like to show off were the ones that were very difficult to obtain either through high-end crafting or high-end adventuring. Now, obviously, crafting was present in Second Life, but there was really no form of adventure, if I'm remembering correctly. Was there any form of adventuring in Second Life?
It depended on the user. Some users had like theme parks or carnivals.
But those two were properties that had been created by other players.
Right.
But in EverQuest, it sometimes required groups, maybe even guilds, raids to obtain some of these high-end prestige items that you could get and take home and show off in your apartment. How do you feel about that aspect of this? As we go further away from the Second Life model and get more into a standard MMO model, do you think the concept of tying player housing so tightly in with either the adventuring or the crafting side of it, is it something that works? Is it a good balance, or is it just unnecessarily clogging up the system?
Oh, no, I think it's a good balance because it makes sure that people come back and check on their homes because they're very important to them. Mm-hmm. I mean, people get very attached to virtual items, believe me. People get very attached to the weapons they're customized to using or the armor they use. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing with player housing. When someone makes a house in the player housing available to them, they really get attached to those things that they have there, the way it looks or whatever. And it keeps them playing. It keeps them paying the company.
And I'll be honest, actually, during my short stint in EQ2, I was known to do quests purely for the purpose of getting a new table. I mean, right. it was content that I might not have otherwise explored if not for the fact that I got a trophy that I could put in my house. Now,
but having that trophy, you're proud of it and you want to keep it. Even though it's virtual, you can't touch it, you can't smell it, you can't do anything with it except enjoy it in that one world. It was still important to you.
Yeah, and actually just talking about it right now kind of makes me want to re-up my EQ2 account. Of course, I've probably been long evicted from my apartment by now.
Well, you could get reunited with your table.
That's right, my precious table.
You're precious.
Now, in your experience with EQ2, I know you weren't exactly a long-term expert or anything, but were there any major faults that you saw as experienced within your little hovel there by the river?
It was terrible. I wouldn't even want to show that to anybody and say that was player housing, because I did see some really nice homes that were very elaborate mansions, and mine was terrible. But it did serve its purpose for me because I preferred to be out questing and experiencing and leveling and so forth. I really didn't want to spend time in my little hovel. But when I did hang out there, I did craft. I did at least furnish the place with a few things that I had gotten from adventuring and all the crafting stations. So I put all those in there and I would just do my thing in there, and I could just go to the broker like on the wall and put the things that I made on the broker.
Oh, and yeah, that's another good point to bring up.
That was one of the things I liked about it. That way I didn't have to brave the lag of all the people standing around the broker, and I didn't have to travel anywhere in order to craft. I just ported to my house. And
that was a huge boon to the economy, specifically for crafters, that you could basically stand in your own private instance in your home and run your entire business out of there that was accessible from elsewhere by other players, so they could purchase and have your items delivered without ever having to set foot in your home.
That's right.
Which
it was
means,
a very, very nice system. I liked it.
Which also does mean that they never got the opportunity to particularly see your home, and if it was very well decorated, that could leave you coming up short there a little bit, but sounds like yours was nothing to look at.
No, it was not. But I did have friends in my guild that had really, really gone to town as far as the tools that were available to them to create this beautiful environment. And I was very impressed with that. But it just wasn't my thing. But there are people out there that it is their thing. It is something that they like to do.
Yes, absolutely. As evidenced by the fact that Second Life is still going strong. And
Yes,
as we
it
said
is.
earlier, it's basically based primarily around owning and customizing your own little section of the world.
And your avatar.
Mm-hmm.
Avatar is very important with the customization, looks and things.
Well, maybe eventually in some future MMO, they'll implement some sort of personal tailor that you can also not only personalize your home, but also your face.
Well, you could customize anything in Second Life. I mean, you're only limited by your imagination. That was the only thing that limited you.
So do you find a system like EQ2 was actually confining in any way, or did it, as you said earlier, actually strike a good balance?
I felt it struck a good balance. Maybe you didn't have the freedom that you might have had in Second Life, but you could really portray whatever your interests were as far as player housing and decoration, social things. Some people had some social, like if I remember, there was like a Monday coffee hour or something, and a lot of people would gather in this one person's home, and they would, have fun and hang out and chat and so forth. They talk about the game, they talk about the developer, whatever.
Right.
So it did take place like that, but not on the scale of Second Life. Second Life was all about events, all about gatherings of avatars, lots of avatars in one place.
Now, as the MMO industry continues to move forward and more new games come out, is there anything do you think that the systems behind Everquest II would be worth emulating in a new game? Or let me just come out and admit this to you. Everquest II is, in my opinion, one of the best housing systems ever implemented in an MMO. But I don't think that the industry moving forward has room for that particular feature in the way that games are moving. Sadly enough, I don't see that any future MMO being launched with a similar type of housing. Am I wrong here, or?
I don't know. I think you're partially right. The thing is that when MMOs are launched and they come out with a certain set of expected features. Whatever they, advertise prior to launch, the pre-launch kind of spiel. And players expect those things to come out. So I would see that player housing is kind of something you save probably for an expansion, a content update, or something like that. I don't think that a game has to launch with player housing. I think it's a nice thing to have because there is a large subset of players that really enjoy decorating a home and all the benefits. Also guild leaders that like to have a guild hall because
Right.
maybe they get specific raid benefits with having the guild hall.
Mm-hmm.
And then the convenience, perhaps, if there's vendors that you can have in there, instead of having to go to town and brave a lag, if that's someone that you're experiencing, you can go to your guild hall instead. Use the auction house there or something like that if you wanted to.
Now, we talked earlier about how Everquest II's housing, aside from just being this fun little pastime that you could decorate your home however you liked and set up your own special little trophies and go adventuring for them and all that, the broker system and the ability to access that and sell your wares as a crafter right from there was a very strong functionality to make people want to use their homes, specifically
Yes.
for crafters.
That was the only reason I used mine, really.
Right.
There's the only reason. There was no other reason but that, because it was convenient.
So it would be safe to say that any future game that was interested in implementing housing would have to have some sort of reason for the players to use it in a manner that actually benefited them over the long term.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Well, great, Ruth. It was a pleasure to have you on the show. If we ever come back to Second Life, you can bet I'll be tapping your brain for that one, since I'm not that much of an expert myself. So, yeah, thanks for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. It was an honor.
Now, sitting in with me to discuss one of the most topical and slightly controversial games right at this moment in time is Heather, whom you also might know from our show SciBite, and is also known as Mars Base. We're going to be talking about Star Wars Galaxies, which she's got a box of it right behind her head. Isn't that appropriate?
I do.
Now, Heather, you and I are both admitted addicts to Star Wars Galaxies interior decorating.
Yes.
In fact, I will go so far as to say that to admit that for a short time in my period in Star Wars Galaxies, I was actually employed as an interior decorator, and I would actually go to people's houses and rearrange their furniture for them.
That's awesome.
I know, and creating fireplaces and fish tanks and fountains out of different bits of stuff. But you were also equally addicted. You were telling me early stories about you and your husband used to do this.
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah, it was what we did in our free time. It's kind of like what we did together, we didn't necessarily go out. We'd go and collect bits and pieces. So we'd, research where we could get this little bit and bot and then drop it in our house and help each other like, oh, wait, no, step that way and drop it. Oh, step this way and drop it. Oh, just a little that way.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but prior to the launch of Star Wars Galaxies, they talked up a lot about the fact that you would be able to live, not just live in the Star Wars universe, but own your own house and decorate it exactly how you wanted to. And if I recall correctly, there were even pictures of like things hanging on walls and things sitting on tables and stuff. This was prior to launch.
Yeah.
And yet, at the time of launch, Sony had the gall. I even pound on the table while I say this, to launch the game without the ability to move items along the Z-axis.
I can believe that.
Or is that Y-axis? Of the up and down axis.
The up and down axis.
Were you just as incensed about that as I was?
Yeah, I'm like, why do I have a table?
I can't put anything on it.
Dust from settling on my stuff that's on the floor. I want my food on a table. I want my cool junk on a table.
Now, later on, I mean much later on, because I played up till just after the launch of their Jump to Lightspeed expansion. I know that you came back after that. Up till that point, you also had no options to, you still had no options to raise things off the floor, if I remember correctly.
I think so.
I remember the moment of abject glee that occurred when I bought my first medium Tatooine house that had a staircase.
Yeah.
Because then finally I could drop items up the stairs and then move them around the house on that XY plane, and they would be floating in the air, and I could measure out the exact height that I needed to get them to sit on a table or to sit on the edge of a chair.
Need to go one stair down. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
Shoot it off into the room.
Looking back, it was ridiculous for that moment to be so joyful for me, because Sony! It was their oversight that caused that moment to mean so much to me, but it was something that just should have been there from the beginning.
For as much creativity and, everything had a 3D model, the gray junk you picked up, all creatures had models.
Yeah,
for everything that they put into it, not to put in the Z-axis was just so ridiculous. It was just beyond comprehension.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, later on they did eventually put in the Z-axis, and even you could unlock the ability to
pitch and
yaw, which basically means tilt things.
Yep. And so it could just be however position you wanted it to be in.
Those jerks, they didn't do it until after I stopped playing, though.
Yeah. I came back and found that. Like, I've stepped away and come back to this game I don't know how many times now. Mm-hmm. But when I came back and found that, I was so excited. I was like, I was giddy like a wee little schoolgirl.
Now, back in those days, I do remember that there was a very avid and very small community built around building things. Like I'd mentioned earlier that I was sometimes employed to build things like fish tanks. I recall that was also in kind of the fledgling periods of YouTube, and in fact, one of the things that introduced me to YouTube so heavily was people showing off the insides of their houses from other servers. I even made characters on other servers to check out those fish tanks in person. I mean, this is avid community following that was all just built around the fact that you could drop an item and then move it.
Yeah, and you could move items on top of each other. The only collision physics was the walls.
Yeah.
So you could,
and even then, you could sometimes stick things into the wall a little bit.
Just a little.
Mm-hmm.
But being able to combine, just anything you could find in the server into whatever your creativity came, you could use math to say, move it exactly this much, tilt, once they had pitch and yaw, I could tilt it this way, have very exact measurements on how to make these things.
You could use math. I was just recalling that they had a specific gray tile thing in the game that at the time that I was really heavily into interior decorating, I knew exactly how many coordinates it was from one side of that. God, I was a nerd. But this is the kind of level of detail that people that are really into player housing really go in for. And it was only enhanced during Star Wars Galaxies by the fact that almost everything that you decorated your house with was made by other players. In fact, the houses themselves were made by other players. All of
part of the architecture.
Exactly. And many of the materials used to build those houses, especially the high-end houses, could only be obtained by going out and adventuring and harvesting them off of either difficult animals or getting them from specific vendors that were often I don't know. I was a crafter.
Yeah.
I don't know where they got them, but I know that I had to pay people to get them for me.
Yeah.
Just so that I could sit around and move a tapestry up and down a wall.
Yeah.
It was an insane amount of community involvement.
Oh, yeah. And you could, people who, had merchants and vendors, you could create your house like it was like a store, and then you could leave your house open so that other people could come and see it. And it was just very community involved. It's like, oh, these people have this little bit, and for collections, you could, gather things, and some things were really rare. So you could buy these little rare items off these people so that you could create your little collection and turn it into this little, to the Star Wars chess table or whatever.
In some ways, and if Ruth were still here, she might find this insulting, but I think that in some ways Star Wars Galaxies is one of the MMOs that comes the closest to the experience that the Second Life players have, where you are the entire economy, the entire world is driven to a certain extent by owning your own portion of the world and decorating it and making it your own. And that included the economy was all based around the crafting. All of the adventurers were at some levels generally feeding a crafter materials so that they could craft new things. And most of that ended up spilling down into decorating your house the way that you wanted it, at least in my experience. And maybe that's a little biased.
That's okay.
I never killed a Rancor. I'll admit that. I never killed a single Rancor. But I know friends that farmed them for the bones.
Yeah.
I don't remember why.
I remember going out and killing Rancors, and I remember going out and we did that part of the game too. But it was like the downtime, and we would it kept us subscribing, for more time, because it was just, we're tired of going out and grinding or trying to find a quest, and let's go out and find this little bit. So we go out and have to grind a creature for this little bit, or just buy it if we wanted to, and then sit there and decorate our house to redecorate, Oh, let's find a new house, oh, they've put out new houses with windows. And
ooh. Now, later on in the life of the game, this was still while I was still playing, though, they actually implemented into the game itself something that I don't recall seeing in any other MMO prior or to date. It was actual player cities, where groups of players and specific class of players that were politicians, there was actually a politician class in this game, could own a large portion of land and then be in control of the zoning and control of taxation and things like that. Now, like I said, there might be another game out there that does that, but none to my knowledge that I've actually experienced firsthand. This is taking player housing to a whole new level where players are actually in control of entire municipalities.
Yeah, and you could, I don't remember the exact details because I was never really involved with the city, but you could get a shuttle port.
Yeah, you could.
So now you're suddenly part of the travel system, too.
So people could take a shuttle directly from Mos Eisley to your city in the middle of the Dune Sea without having to run the entire way there and avoiding all the Jawas on the way. Now, this is something that you told me earlier while we were prepping for this segment that you were never really involved with those player cities.
Yeah.
You tended to try to find a secluded area where you and your husband could have your pretty cabin in the woods to decorate off in the middle of nowhere. I was actually at one point a mayor of one of those sprawling urban developments on the Tatooine Dune Sea. It was humongous. So this particular facet never really frustrated me all that much, but I have heard several players and former players of Star Wars Galaxies get incensed over the urban sprawl that happened as a result of the fact that everybody could own their own houses, could own multiple houses, and harvesters, which would, dig up ore and stuff like that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, did you encounter much of that?
Yeah, it was kind of hard. It depended on parts of at different points in the game. Like here recently, we were trying to find, some little secluded place. And my husband would spend hours, traveling around planet, days, trying to find some place where it was, there was nobody else. And it's kind of funny because, I don't remember the part in Star Wars where R2-D2 and C-3PO run across the city. They just kind of ran across the Jawas because no one else was there.
There was nothing else to run across.
The camera pans around and there's nothing there.
Right. There's no big mega complex mall off in the distance selling
there's no
Jawa treats.
Yeah, you're not running across a merchant going, buy my wares. They're the best in the galaxy. So
Repeating ad infinitum.
yes. So it was kind of you kind of had to accept a little bit of breakage there because, you wanted your house.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone else should get their house.
Now, I
But once
wonder,
everyone gets their house, there's
you've
lots of houses.
You've played a few other MMOs in your life as well, and I wonder how you feel about most other MMOs. In fact, now that I think about it, Star Wars Galaxies might be one of the only MMOs that I played. Ultima Online also comes to mind, where you could place your own house.
Yeah.
Every other game out there on the market tends to use some sort of built-in door that zones you into your own personal instance of some sort. Do you have an opinion on it? Is one better than the other, or is it all just a big give and take?
Well, in some ways, it's a big give and take. Now, the one thing that I always that's a game breaker for me is if it's instance for you only. I mean, half the reason why I had fun was because me and my husband would get together and do this, or sometimes we'd have a friend that we'd help out, but. That was the point.
Well, just like I said earlier, I used to decorate for other people that just didn't feel like decorating their own homes. I would go and do it for them. And if it was their house, if I couldn't access it, then that entire side of my gameplay would never have existed. I would never have met a bunch of, some of the people that I've interacted with from Star Wars Galaxies, even though I haven't played in years, they still invite me to their Halloween parties. Who knew? I mean, these are long-lasting friendships built around a specific sub-facet of Star Wars Galaxies. There was so much more to the game.
Oh, yeah.
But this is all there really needed to be for me and my buddies.
Yeah.
And I think I just keep coming back to that. And actually, it's kind of sad in the news recently. I mentioned at the top of this segment that Star Wars Galaxies is a bit topical and a bit controversial because Sony just recently announced that they're going to be shutting down Star Wars Galaxies in December of this year. You and I were talking before going on the air here, and I think we're both going to be re-upping before the end here. It's kind of like if you hear about your favorite theme park's going to shut down, you want to go one last time and ride the rides, even if they suck.
Yeah.
You got to go back and you got to experience it one last time.
Yep.
Maybe make some new friends, some new memories. So, in fact, I'm going to go on the record as saying that at some point prior to the shutdown of Star Wars Galaxies, we're going to dedicate an entire episode of The Morgue in memory of this once great title and all of its pitfalls. We'll talk about the NGE, we'll talk about the combat upgrade, we'll talk about everything, and I'll try to, if you'd like, we'll have you back on the show, and maybe you guys out there, if you're interested in being a part of that, send me a note over to MMOrgue at jupiterbroadcasting.com or post over on jupitercolony.com. So you and I both have fond memories of the way that Star Wars Galaxies in particular implemented their housing system. I'm wondering, it's an old system. We haven't seen anything like this come out since then.
No.
You being, you're somewhat savvy of the MMO industry as a whole. You obviously would be, or you wouldn't be my friend. Do you have any opinion on whether or not you think that this level of integration of player housing might, is this something that belongs in the MMO industry anymore, or has it had its day? Or is it just that developers are getting lazy and don't want to put in the efforts? What do you think?
Well, it's tough to say. I mean, my dream would be for lots of MMOs to have this kind of a thing, like especially like Tor coming out, because I love that facet of the game. It really gives me downtime. For a lot of MMOs, I'll keep them up for a few months and then I'll drop them for a few months. I'll bring them back and I'll come back and forth because if I get burned out, I don't want to pay. So I'll drop for a month. But that kind of a thing keeps me paying because I don't have to go out and fight if I don't want to, or if I'm busy, I don't feel bad about just, logging on for 5 minutes and decorating my house. But it is a level of detail that you don't find in you don't really find in any MMOs, and I don't think it'll be in many, but I can still hope and dream that it will be there.
So you think that this is not something that so much has had its day, just as the fact that developers are for some reason not going there at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot to it, and I think that's one of the things that they either have to decide, yes, we're going to do customization, and that takes a chunk of time to make all the 3D models and decide, are you going to have it, open to the world, city style, like Galaxies had, or, will you have it instanced, or, how will you implement it? But it is a chunk of time that may not be on their radar for, their top things of importance. Do they add it to the game later? Do they have it to a smaller degree?
Well, sometimes clearly putting in some of those features are really hard, like a Z-axis, right?
Yeah, I mean, it took them a while to add that, apparently. You can do everything else except lift your object up off the floor.
Boy, gravity must have been a when they first rolled out.
Oh yeah, they had the gravity turned up way too high.
All right, well, Heather, I think that's all we got for Star Wars Galaxies. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you
I'll
for
talk
having
to you
me.
again very soon, I'm sure.
Yep.
Up next on our roster of awesome is Sean, who some of you that might be fans of Stoked, our other show here at Jupiter Broadcasting, might recognize as a vocal member of the community there on Star Trek Online. Also goes by the name Peregrine Falcon. Peregrine, thanks for joining us.
Hey, no problem.
Now, we're going to be talking a little bit about Star Trek Online to start with, and then we're going to kind of branch out our conversation from there. But like I said, why don't we start with Star Trek Online and their kind of, well, it's kind of player housing. Let's talk a little bit about ship interiors. Now, ship interiors were implemented first as just slightly customizable. You could choose a bridge, basically. But even this wasn't available at the time of launch. Now, you, being an active member of the community, have a lot of background with watching this whole story unfold. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how the whole concept of ship interiors came about with Star Trek Online?
Well, they announced a number of months before closed beta even that ship interiors weren't going to be in the game at launch. Mm-hmm. There was a small but vocal community on the forums at the time who lobbied very hard for player housing in the form of ship interiors.
You say small. There are actual folks in the community that actually think that it might have been as little as 4 or 5, maybe 6 people out there that were that entirely comprised this small vocal minority that just kind of flooded the forums with requests for ship interiors.
Yeah, constant multiple threads for months until finally the devs basically gave in. A couple of months before launch, I want to say September, October, they announced that the art team had managed to free up some time in their schedule, had worked hard, put in some overtime, and that bridges would be available at launch. The bridge, of course, was just a single room that you couldn't do anything in. You could see your bridge officers there. Mm-hmm. Since then, they've added some more actual interiors, some corridors, some rooms. In Season 3, they added the ability to place some trophies. In December 2009, a console was added to the Captain's Ready Room that allows players to go into their interiors and to access mission replay.
Now, that console added to the Captain's Ready Room is actually the first example of some sort of functional mechanic actually available within those ship interiors. This leads me back to when was it? There was a player poll at one point that many kind of anticipate was made slightly in response to that small vocal community that kept requesting specific features of ship interiors. That poll, do you recall the date when that went around?
Yeah, it was about 2 months after the game launched. It was in April of 2010. Mm-hmm. A community manager started a forum poll. There was a little over 10,000 people voted in it. And despite all of the lobbying for customization and the wanting accurate floor plans and it to be laid out like the ship is supposed to be laid out, functionality was actually the winning selection at 43%, and it easily beat out the 2 runners-up, accurate floor plan and authenticity.
Mm-hmm. By a pretty wide margin, which just goes to show that you can't always, I guess, you can't really rely on those vocal minorities that might be making their opinion so widely known, when it's a fact of the matter is that this poll and its results showed that at least the players that were interested in voting in the poll did not feel the same as that vocal minority.
Well, the difference is, too, is the poll was accessed from the launcher, which means all the players could see it, even the ones who didn't go on the forums.
That's a very good point. And it's a very good way to reach more players.
No, yeah, like I said, since then, a few things have been added, some rooms and corridors. You can pick different bridges, still no customizability, and no other functionality other than the mission replay.
And since we're talking about functionality real quick, I'd actually like to go back to that mission replay console that we just talked about previously. This mechanic was added to the game as it was touted up as a very big feature, but the specific mechanic is only available from you going into your ship interior and then finding it in your ready room. Not only is this a little clunky, but it also is the sole mechanical reason that you should ever need to interact with your ship's interior. This is a really big disconnect. I know that the Cryptic developers have talked about adding more functionality to the ship over time, but as it stands right now, having a single function that is not accessible anywhere else in the game and forces you to interact with a feature that you might have no interest in is a huge disconnect and kind of an insult, really. I mean, with the state of the rest of the ship interiors, if you're trying to compare this to player housing or customizable ship interiors, honestly, it is a little bit insulting, and forcing people to interact with it just to get to this feature is clunky, is unintuitive, and frankly, just not a good choice.
Yeah, and the problems with the mission replay feature are that, first of all, it's not really mentioned anywhere in-game.
Right.
So I still see in in-game chat channels people asking about stuff. They're told about mission replay. They don't know about mission replay at all. Then they don't know how to access it. And then the problem is, like, a lot of these missions are organized in specific arcs. You have 4 or 5 missions that's part of a specific featured series. Mm-hmm. And so you have to zone into your bridge interior, get the one mission, come back out, share it with everyone else, do that mission, come back into your ship interior to get the next one in the series, and it's not real clear which one is next on the list. Basically, it's just difficult to imagine that this could have been implemented in a way that would be any more inconvenient for the players.
Honestly, I completely agree. Now, we are talking, though, about a Star Trek game. And any fan of Star Trek that's watched the series, the television series, or the movies knows that there are quite a few stories and episode arcs that take place entirely within their ship interiors. And I think...
The ship in a bottle episodes, yeah?
Yeah, and I think that was one of the big motivators for trying to get these ship interiors put into the game. But at the same time, so many people requested functionality and customization of them that, well, let me put it to a different way. Making a mission that takes place in a customized environment might not be a reality. It might just be something that is too far beyond technological means to incorporate. So as a fan of Star Trek, which I know you are, would you personally be willing to sacrifice customization of your ship interiors, and maybe even sacrifice the ability to access it at all, if it meant that you could play missions inside your ship?
Absolutely. I would love to be able to do some of these missions that take place mostly or completely in the ship, because what are those missions always, or those episodes? What were those episodes all about? They were about the people in the ship. They were about character building and development. You get to know the people that are on board your ship. And if done right, those could easily be some of the best missions in the game. Mm-hmm. And if I had to sacrifice, if I no longer had the ability to place a couple of meaningless trophies in my ready room, or if I no longer had the ability to get a specific sofa to put in my ready room, yeah, I would willingly give up that to have what could, as I said, be some of the best missions in the game.
Now let's talk a little bit about the developer itself, Cryptic Studios. We're going to be actually shifting gears to City of Heroes. They're one of their previous titles here in just a minute. But before we move on, I wonder, the fact that these ship interiors seem to have come about as a result of their community's involvement, of their vocal community's pleas to incorporate this, does it strike you in any way as making you feel less confident about their goals, their vision of where they want this game to be in the future?
Well, I think that it's obvious that they don't really seem to have any kind of long-term plan. Every new patch note says, we added this, and then the next patch note is, we added something completely different. They don't have a kind of a long-term goal where they build, first the base of a particular item, and then they expand on that item and make it better and better. So, yeah, I would say that it looks like right now that they're going around grabbing the low-hanging fruit, adding each little thing they can as the tech becomes, finished.
And just responding to the community's pleas for specific things that they can manage to pull out.
Some of the community anyway, yeah.
Yeah, some of them. Yeah, let's not go into the Klingon play in this episode. You guys need to watch Stoked for more on that.
Hey, I didn't even say it.
I knew where you were heading with that. And Rocket Boots. Okay, let's talk a little bit about City of Heroes then, because as most of you watching this probably know, City of Heroes was originally developed by Cryptic Studios, but several years later, I don't have the date here in front of me, but was handed off to NCSoft, who would continue the publishing and the development on City of Heroes. Now, prior to handing that off, Cryptic Studios actually was in control of the game completely, all the way up until after the launch of their big expansion, City of Villains. And part of City of Villains was superhero bases, the base building. Now, you, Peregrine, that's his Stowe name, by the way. I know it says Sean over his head over there, but we all call him Peregrine. You were involved very heavily with the base building community. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm Peregrine Falcon on the City of Heroes forums, just like the Star Trek Online forums. And I was heavily involved in the base building community for years until it became apparent that they just weren't going to do anything with bases.
Aww.
City of Heroes launched in April 2004. Supergroup bases, their version of guild halls, weren't added until, as you said, the first paid expansion, City of Villains, which didn't go live until issue 6 in October of 2005.
Mm-hmm.
The customizability at launch was very limited. You had a small, medium, and large plot size that you could purchase. And then on the plot size, you had a couple of basic rooms that you could place. Each room had to be separated by this short, wide corridor. So consequently, instead of looking like a modern supergroup base like the JPL Satellite or Four Freedoms Plaza, it ended up looking like an old-fashioned D&D adventure module with the various rooms laid out and separated by the stereotypical 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot corridor.
That are always filled with either hordes of goblins or traps, but...
Yeah. And at launch, the players had the ability to pick from a dozen or so styles for the walls, ceiling, and floors, like
so they could paint it a little bit, make it look pretty.
Yeah, different types of tile for the floor, brick or wooden walls, that sort of thing. You could change the colors a little bit. There were about a dozen functional items, some storage, teleporters to the various zones in the City of Heroes world, and a little more than 100 or so decorative items. Now, over 5 years later...
Well, that doesn't sound bad for the time of launch. Like about a dozen functional, 100 non-functional. That sounds decent.
Yeah. Now, over 4 or 5 years later, they've managed to add about 8 or so functional items to that list. And that's it.
No more decorative items even?
Nope. They have made building bases a little bit easier by removing a script that controlled clipping of items. So now people can place those items in front of doors, inside another item, stack them on top of each other. And the base building community has been very creative about taking these items, combining them together, and retasking them to become something else.
Yeah, I can imagine. I know that sounds like that might sound like a small feature to somebody that isn't really involved with this, but being able to like push items halfway through a wall and stuff like that, that's a really big thing for being creative in these environments. Now, you said that over the course of those 5 years, this is all that they've managed to do. Have there been talks of adding other features or anything like that?
No. While the base building community was at one time very active with multiple in-game channels where people would give each other advice and certain tips and tricks on how to do certain things, they would hold base contests and tours, but the community has just been allowed to simply wither away and die. Cryptic Studios completely ignored the base building community and all of their multiple wish lists and requests for additions and even simple bug fixes.
Now that sounds like a major accusation there to say that they ignored it, but you're actually speaking in accurate, literal terms. There was no commentary ever made within their base building subforum.
Well, the devs in Cryptic Studios and now Paragon Studios, which is the subsidiary of NCSoft, they are very active on the forums. They post a lot, they respond to a lot of people's questions, but they simply refuse to even respond to any post that mentions bases whatsoever, and they never post in the base building forums. When they sold the game to NCSoft in November 2007, NCSoft continued Cryptic Studios' tradition of ignoring the base building community. Well, actually, not completely ignored. When Well, when issue 9 went live in May of 2007, they introduced finally introduced a crafting system to City of Heroes. One of the things they did as part of the crafting system was to severely nerf base storage units. They were reduced from being able to hold 2,500 items down to a mere 30 items.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah.
Whoa on its own, but at the same time that they implement crafting, which is like notorious in every MMO ever for just chewing up your inventory space like crazy.
One of the few times that a developer did respond to any commentary on bases, they stated flat out that they were just basically scared to death that people would hoard these items instead of putting them up on the exchange for sale.
Well, man, with that kind of a response, I think scared to death is a pretty accurate assessment there.
Right.
2,500 down to 30. Man.
And later in 2008, the lead developer at the time, Positron, announced that the new major patch, issue 13, was going to include lots of additions and improvements for bases. People, as you can imagine, were just,
giddy, probably.
jubilant. Yeah. A few months later, when they announced that feature creep required them to split that major update into two separate issues, what would be issues 13 and 14, and they listed what were going to be in each of those two issues, the previously mentioned additions and improvements for bases weren't on either of those lists. And none of the developers even responded to any of the literally hundreds of posts asking them simply what happened.
So they just vanished? All of these planned features that were initially going to be in issue 13 just up in smoke?
Gone with no explanation. To this day, no one knows what happened. They just won't say.
Well, okay, as if that weren't enough to get your hopes up and then dashed one more time on the base building, later on, after NCSoft had control of the development, they introduced a new developer named Sunstorm, who was introduced as the base building developer. Give us more of a backstory on how he appeared and what it led to.
So in November of 2008, a new developer, as you said, Sunstorm, was introduced. He's a new hire. He's going to be the base building developer. He started a thread and said, hey guys, give me lists of all the stuff that you want to be added to bases, all the new cool stuff. Give me suggestions on how to improve them, et cetera, et cetera. We made, of course, hundreds of posts, linked him to all the wish list threads and all the threads that had lists of base bugs and just everything we had. He made a few more posts and then went silent. Until almost a year later, in October of 2009.
Almost a year, and still nothing was implemented during that window either.
Nope. And the base building developer basically just quit talking to us. So in response to a couple of forum private messages from the players where we basically begged him to just come into the base developer or the base building forums and just post anything, hi, I'm still alive, he did. He posted that he's still, there and he's still working on some stuff for bases. And then about 2 months later, someone noticed that his forum name was no longer read. In the past, that only happened on the forums when someone was no longer employed at NCSoft, and then they would lock out their account, remove their dev privileges, and the name would turn white.
So that was approximately 13 months after being introduced as the head of the base building project, during which time not one damn thing happened.
And then he's no longer working at NCSoft. That's correct.
Well,
so the base building
point,
community in City Heroes is now dead. In over 5 years since bases were introduced to the game, less than a dozen functional items have been added. No decorative items have ever been added. Things were nerfed. Other things were allowed to remain buggy and broken for years at a time.
Not to mention, how many times can you cry wolf, right? At least 2 or 3 major times throughout this development cycle, the developers have come out and said, bases will get an improvement, and then nobody sees anything, or sees major nerfs in the case of that issue 9 storage nerf.
Yeah, in fact, many times people have just begged the developers to just show up in the base building forums and just tell us, hey, look, we're not doing anything with bases. To just come out and tell us so that we could quit getting our hopes up. They wouldn't even do that. And like I said, I was an active participant in the base building community in City Heroes for years until it became very obvious to me that the developers just planned to completely ignore bases forever, which is where we're currently at.
Now, I'm curious, from a design standpoint, when they were first talking about implementing player bases, what was the core functionality? What was the purpose that bases were meant to serve? Was it just decoration and places to hang out, or what?
Well, that was part of the problem. They seemed to have two separate goals that actually didn't work well together. One was that it was introduced as part of the villains. And so there was supposed to be PvP in your bases. People would come in and, the villains would invade the hero's base and you would fight them off and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So you had that crowd, and then you had the other crowd who used bases for storage, used it as their version of player housing and that sort of thing. And they didn't want PvP to happen in their bases because they didn't want the stuff that they'd worked hard to build to be destroyed.
Now, after all of this time, is there PvP in bases?
No. A few years ago when they implemented the script to stop clipping, mm-hmm. they also shut off the ability to do any PvP in bases whatsoever. And that's where we're at now. They haven't talked about any future plans for it as far as I know either.
Now, after all of this, after all of the different promises that have been broken along the way, after all of the features that have just gone missing or ignored for so long on this version of player housing, I'm curious, from somebody like you that's been involved with this for a very long time, is there anything that NCSoft could do at this point to make it up to you and the rest of the base building community, or is this just a permanent dark blotch? Are you forever jaded, or could they do something to win you back?
Well, sure. They could actually build actual player housing, or fix and improve the bases that they currently have. I believe that putting significant effort, not talking about it, not planning for it, but actually making it happen in game would go a long ways toward not only smoothing over the things that have happened, but frankly getting a lot of the base building community that's no longer subscribed to the game, getting them to come back and become active participants. There were people that for many years, that was the only reason they stayed subscribed to City of Heroes. They could come in and chat with their friends, and they could work on building and expanding their bases. There were some very creative people. That was what they loved doing.
Now, I'm curious, we've just talked about in our previous episode of the Morgue that City of Heroes is going to be going free-to-play soon. Do you think this might have any impact on future plans to implement additional features in base building?
No, I don't believe so. When they made the announcement here a couple of days ago, the developer, he made a post in the thread explaining that issue 21 was going to be free to play, and this long, detailed post on what was going to happen and how it was going to work. Mm-hmm. The first, of course, response to that was first after developer.
Yeah,
right?
Welcome to the internet.
Yeah. The next response was, so which of those people are going to be working on bases? Now, that thread continued on for a long time, and there are a lot of developer posts in that thread. And they've made a very good effort to respond to and answer every legitimate question by all the players in that thread, except for the one about bases.
So even after all this time, their silence remains intact. I got to tell you, as a fan of the MMO industry, as a watcher of the MMO industry, seeing this level of silence from a developer is downright frightening. That they, I don't want to get too much on my soapbox here, but that they think that they can get away with that and hold on to their player base and keep them interested in their title without even coming out and saying a single damn word. Not a good move, guys. Now that's all about NCSoft, though. Since we were earlier talking about Star Trek Online and how City of Heroes was originally made by Cryptic Studios, I'm curious how you might respond to the news that Cryptic Studios is now introducing player housing into Champions Online in the form of what they're calling hideouts. Now, we don't have a whole lot of information on this just yet, but do you have any initial responses, just a gut reaction at this point?
Given Cryptic Studios' past record with player housing and bases in their other two games, Star Trek Online and City of Heroes. I don't have any real hope or optimism that the hideouts that they're introducing in Champions Online will be worth the time. They'll probably be on the store, so you'll have to, pay real money to use them, of course. And frankly, I don't believe that it will be worth my money.
Now, it's early in the development cycle. Apparently, they're still working on the hideouts, just on the off chance that one of them might tune in. Is there any words of wisdom you might offer to anyone that's involved in making these hideouts to help them avoid the pitfalls of the past?
Yeah, make them worth the time. Have them have customization and functionality, and have it so that that's something that can be expanded upon. So I want to go do that raid mission to get that special, table, or I want to go and do a certain thing and buy a certain item so that I can craft stuff to put in my base. Have functionality there so that anything that needs to be done in the game, I can do from my base or my house, whichever these turn out to be. Let me populate it with NPCs, that walk around and say stuff to me. Let me customize it. Let me make it, tall and with multiple levels, or wide and spread out. Let me put it on different terrain. Make it worth my time. And I will spend month after month after month resubscribing so that I can keep going in and I can keep working on and building and expanding my base, because people that are interested in that, that's what they do.
Mm-hmm. Great, Peregrine. I think most of actually what you've said here was just speaking my mind exactly. I agree with almost everything you've said. So it was great having you on the show as the other half of my brain. And I'm sure we'll keep in touch and have you around in the future if we need to bounce any more ideas around. So thanks again for stopping by.
Glad to help.
Rocket
boots.
Well, that about wraps up most of my thoughts here on player housing. As you can see, it's a topic that hits very close to home. Now, before I let you go for this week's episode, I do have a couple teases to leave you with. Not stories that deserve a whole lot of commentary, but stuff worth mentioning. The first of these is that a company by the name of Dark Cryo Entertainment published a press release recently announcing Firefly Universe Online. Now, hold on to your pants because it's not quite as exciting as that initial announcement makes it sound like it should be. That should be the greatest thing ever, right? I mean, let's be honest. Firefly. Sadly, this company has me worried like crazy. Right now, Firefly Universe Online is unauthorized. What that means is that they have no rights to the Firefly license. They also, at this time, have no funding. In addition to these two facts, Dark Cryo Entertainment has not put a single person's name on their website. And the corporate website for Dark Cryo Entertainment is locked up behind a password barrier. So, we've got a game with nobody officially attached to it, with a company that nobody can find any information about, no license, no permission to make the project, and no money. Well, color me just a little bit darn skeptical, but that doesn't sound like this is going to amount to very much, is it? I'll hold out hope. I think everybody should. It's Firefly. But to be frank, the fact that they're looking for a Unity programmer indicates to me that this game isn't going to be a lot more successful than something along the lines of, let's say Battlestar Galactica Online or Star Trek Infinite Space. Now, on a completely different subject, but slightly as a follow-up to last week's episode of The Morgue, the mother of all MMOs has been receiving some press recently that they're pushing themselves towards a free-to-play model. The headlines read, "WoW goes free-to-play." Don't believe them, okay? These are just annoying websites out there trying to get you to click on their stories. WoW is not going free-to-play. But they are making some very interesting changes to their free trial account. Whereas previously they were limited by an amount of time, you could only play your trial for a certain number of days, the new trial accounts are going to instead be limited by level only, and you will be able to play this game for as long as you like, up to level 20, making as many characters as you like, on as many different servers as you like. This is very similar to the endless trial that's offered by Warhammer Online. But honestly, I don't think it's a really big deal at all. I don't foresee this being even a blip on the subscription radar, and it probably won't make a dent in the fact that WoW continues to, very slowly, lose subscriptions. But good luck to them. Whatever. On next week's episode, we're going to be finally digging into some of the details surrounding the massive amount of drama and controversy that surrounded EVE's recent launch of their Incarna expansion. Oh baby, is this lit up the internet. And I'll try to have all the details for you, as well as where I think this is all melting down into. In addition to that, Hellgate Global's open beta starts, well, it started by the time you're watching this episode. So, based on some of the commentary that I received from my episode all about MMO shooters, I've decided to give this game another shot. Next week's episode is going to have an in-depth review based on a few days of open beta gameplay. So, join me for that, all on next week's show. And until then, everybody, play smart, and remember, sometimes an emote is just an emote.